Hello and welcome to this slightly unusual video. Today we are going to be analyzing a game that is actually currently taking place. The game is between Hikaru Nakamura and Jan Nepo, and it is in the second last round of the FIDE Candidates Chess Tournament of 2024, a round in which these two players are currently both tied for the lead, therefore a very important game. And we join the game here at move 21. It is Hikaru to move. He has the black pieces. And he has what looks like a good position. Now, I have nothing against Jan Nepomniachtchi. In fact, quite like him. But I'm going for Hikaru Nakamura in this game because I would like to see Hikaru win the whole tournament, the Candidates Tournament, and then go up against Ding Liren in the World Championship match. I think that'd be great to see. It'd be very interesting because Hikaru posts his own personal analysis of the games each and every time he plays. And it'd be great to see that in a World Championship match. So I'm going for Hikaru. That's why we're seeing the board from his perspective. But what I've done is I've taken off the computer's evaluation and any kind of variations that the computer wants to show, so that all we see here is the board the way the players see it. We can also see the timer. The players can see that too. Of course, the players are sitting face to face next to each other over the board in Toronto. But this information is being relayed live to the internet, and that's where we are right now. So I can tell you that at least in this position, before I turned off the computer evaluation, which was by default turned on, that the evaluation here is all zeros, meaning dead equal. But to me, I really quite like the position that Hikaru has. And I'll tell you why that is. But perhaps first, let's just go back to the start and have a quick look at how we've got to this position. So the game started e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5. Very famous opening, the Roy Lopez. Hikaru played a6, asking the bishop whether it wants to go through the exchange variation of the Roy Lopez, something I've spoken about on this channel before, or whether it wants to do the more classic approach of dropping back, at which point there are a lot of moves. Very famously would probably be knight f6, the Berlin. Much less common is this idea of bishop c5. Much less common. Now, I guess Hikaru wanted to play something a little bit slightly different and take the game down less familiar territory. And of course, he would be very much prepared for this move, as would both players. But I would imagine Hikaru prepared specifically in this line, and recently as well. So Jan castled, and Hikaru developed his other knight to e7. Again, why would you not put this knight over at f6? Well, look, I'm not going to pretend to understand this move, but if you see what happens in the game, you see c3, and then the knight immediately hops to g6. So now there's another defender of this pawn. So clearly this move, which breaks one of the opening principles, which is that it moves the same piece twice in the opening, firstly to e7, then to g6, is clearly preparation by Hikaru. He's come up with this, whether by himself or with the help of the computer, but this is not something he's just come up with at the board. Now after d4, he tucks the bishop right back here. This pawn is absolutely well defended. And I suppose that if this pawn were to jump forward, the knight has some safe squares, for instance, e7, and what that would do is open up this diagonal for the bishop. Now, I'm not sure that I love that position for black after something like this. It sort of feels like white has a big space advantage. But again, clearly preparation from Hikaru, and he's happy to do this. Now this bishop comes in to attack the queen, and Hikaru just pushes that bishop away. Of course, he wouldn't be able to take it, as it's defended by the knight. So he just pushes it away with the pawn, and it makes itself scarce. Goes back to e3. Now we have a castles. Knight to d2. And king h8, getting off the light square diagonal, which clearly may have been used by Jan at some point with effect, with some sort of tactical effect when timed correctly. But now no such tactics will, work because the movement is not going to come with check. King looks very safe there. We see rook e1, very natural, bringing rook to the center of the board. And now Hikaru decides to initiate a selection or a collection of trades in the center of the board, firstly by taking on d4. Jan takes back with the knight. I kind of would have thought you'd take with this knight. With this pawn. Keep your pawn center intact. This looks a bit unusual to me. In any case, Hikaru takes the chance to continue the trades, which continue a lot. And now we have this central pawn mass for Jan Nepomniachtchi. But a lot of the pieces have come off the board, which kind of tends to make the game inherently more drawish. And again, these two players, it's the second last round. Obviously, both of them want to win against each other since they're both tied for first. But if they both draw against each other, then they're both still alive. And they would go to the last round and potentially be able to beat their next opponent and thereby win. Or at least thereby go into a dead heat playoff. So, we may well see both players happy to take a draw, although obviously either one of them would love to win. At any point at this point, we do see Hikaru also staking a claim in the center. Pawn is captured, queen captures back, and the knight comes to e4. Now, here, Hikaru doesn't do anything particularly fancy by the looks of things. I was initially thinking maybe something like b5 to hit the bishop, but of course the bishop comes back and just attacks the queen. So you don't have time to do anything else. Thought about maybe playing f5, but probably still something like this can be played. So anyway, the queen, although it's in the center, it's nice, it's also vulnerable. So I think Hikaru just puts it back on d8, gets it out of harm's way. And, we still have these ideas potentially in the future, depending on how Jan plays. In the end, Jan played this, so we're not going to see this move. But we do see f5, and the knight jumps, I think, strangely enough, to c5. Strangely enough to c5. We can see that actually Jan is now on the clock. Oh, he was on the clock for about 2 seconds. And it's back to Hikaru Nakamura. So we're getting some action here. We will get to this in a moment. But basically here, yes, the knight's here. I guess it's threatening to jump in here with a fork, supported by the rook. I guess if that happened, the bishop can take. But in that case, you could say Hikaru is giving up a bishop for the knight. You may also be able to say that Hikaru in that position would be giving up a bad bishop for a good knight. So anyway, it is what we see. We see b6, asking the knight what it wants to do. Do you want to jump in here and allow that trade of bad bishop for good knight? Although, that's not the only possibility. We see knight d3, and this kind of now allows this bishop to become really good, because now we have bishop b7 taking aim at the king side. And it looks like a good bishop to me now, and not such a scary knight. I mean, the knight can come here, and that is what we see, supported by a pawn, but, I mean, it could always be captured. That would give white a passed pawn. It would now be beyond any other pawns, whereas here it's still not beyond this pawn. So I don't think Hikaru wants to take, but it does also allow this nice move, queen g5, and then we have d5 by Jan Nepomniachtchi, and this was the position where we initially joined the game, where the time was equal. And clearly Hikaru has been thinking quite a lot, because a few moves earlier, Hikaru actually had about an extra 15 minutes on the clock. So Hikaru is spending a lot of time here. He must be thinking that he's on the cusp of a win. That's what I'm thinking, because look at all this pressure that's here against g2. Now, my first reaction against g2 was actually, why not just play knight f4? If you play knight f4 here as Hikaru, firstly, you have an immediate checkmate threat. If you can imagine the knight here, can I play this move in analysis? I can. If you can imagine this move, the threat is just to go checkmate. And it's kind of doesn't seem immediately obvious how you defend against that. Just to show a couple of lines, you can't bring the bishop in to defend, because obviously you can just take that, and then the threat is back on and you're a bishop down. You can't do something like this, because, well, in the first case, you're not threatening to take the knight. And in the second case, at the very least, I mean, I haven't done the calculations on this, but you could just take that pawn. That's a free pawn by the looks of things, with check to come or something like that. Or maybe you could just take with the knight if you wanted to do it even safer, and you've just lost a pawn. So this knight f4 looks really good. You can't really just, I don't think, bring the knight back because of checkmate as well. Can't bring the knight back here, obviously, because you just take it with the pawn or the queen. So it just sort of looks like in this position with knight f4, white was going to have to take time out to defend the pawn, and then this pawn might drop. Now, the obvious exception to that is, what if queen came to f3, defending the checkmate threat and also defending the pawn? Well, it doesn't defend the pawn enough, because now we would come in with this move, I would imagine, hitting the queen, winning a pawn. Now, if the queen comes here, well, remember, you have won a pawn already. You have already won a pawn, so even if you were just to trade and drop the knight back somewhere, you'd be up a pawn. So I really thought that this move, knight f4, was nice. And like I said, the computer evaluation here was still equal. Still equal. But from a human perspective, it seemed pretty nice for black. Black's attacking. Doesn't look like there's a lot of risk in the position. The king still looks quite calm and safe. Now, the other move that came to mind, of course, I did also consider sacrifices like this, because it's always fun to do. Taking here with check, and if the queen was silly enough to take, then there would also be this check with a nice fork, although I don't think that would be good anyway, because you've given up too much material in that trade, even though you get a fancy fork. There's so many problems with this variation, but it's just something I thought about. And I wonder if, maybe there was other options to do with this fork. If you were to take here first, obviously at the level of the candidates, you're not going to see moves like this, because they play a lot better than this simple traps. But yeah, the other move I thought of other than knight f4, although I think I would have played knight f4, I also thought about rook a d1. Rook a d1, which is ultimately what Hikaru played. Just putting pressure on this pawn. This is, after all, an isolated pawn. It's pretty far advanced. You could almost wonder whether it's overextended. It's defended by the queen, but it's attacked now twice. If it steps forward, for example, to d6, there is an immediate checkmate because of this previously perhaps bad bishop that became a good bishop, now supporting the queen. So the pawn can't move forward, you need to defend it. So after that long think, Hikaru did in fact play this move, rook a d8. And then what was actually played on the board? Bishop b3 was played by Jan Nepomniachtchi, defending the pawn. And then it was over to Hikaru again. Now, what would you play here if you were Hikaru? I guess you could always still play this knight f4, going for the threat. This is still alive. But instead he played this move c5. That's interesting. Now, of course, the pawn can't be taken en passant. If it was, or I guess it could. It could be taken en passant, really. And actually, this is where we now rejoin the position with Jan Nepomniachtchi thinking. He's thinking about what he can do here. Can he take en passant? Well, probably not. And the major reason why not is because the queen would hang. Even though he would then win this bishop and be very close to promoting, this rook always guards the promotion square. Although in that position, there's also the, I guess, complicating factor that this knight can jump onto f7 with check. And if the king moves on to g6, then the knight here can jump away somewhere. And there's a discovered check. King has to move back. And you can have a repetition there, really. I'll actually show the line. So if it's en passant takes, you could basically start this movement right now. Check. Now, really though, you would take with the rook, because if you do anything else, you lose your queen with check. You have to move back anyway. And this is the kind of, again, this is check. Repetition that may be available, unless the only way the repetition can be sort of avoided there. What's happening here? The only way that that could have been avoided would be if the knight were taken. But anyway, it's all a moot point because Jan Nepomniachtchi has made his move. He has played the knight back. The knight has come back from e5 back to f3. Now, I would like to actually go back to the regular board, not this analysis board. So how do I do that? Maybe I'll refresh the page. That's better. Now, we'll flip the board around again. And it's now Hikaru's turn to move, and we've rejoined the game. We don't know what the analysis is. We don't know what the evaluation of the position is. But we can see that Jan is now asking Hikaru to do something about this queen. He doesn't like the attack that Hikaru may have had against the king, and he's now saying, just get out of my side of the board. Get out. Don't want you here anymore. So I guess the most natural move would be queen f6. But Hikaru plays queen h5 before we have time to look at anything else. Also very logical, pinning the knight so that if it moves anywhere, at the very least, there is the option to trade queens. That's at the very least. But also just keeping the queen active in, staring at this king. Hopefully, hoping to create problems for Jan. Now, I'm not sure exactly how the time controls work in the FIDE candidates. Both players have a bit over half an hour, but I'm sure they get another half an hour at a certain point, probably when they reach move 30 or 40. Let's have a look. Time control FIDE candidates. 120 minutes for the first 40 moves, then 30 for the rest of the game, plus an increment from move 41. So they've got basically this half an hour, 38, 40 minutes, 35, 34 minutes to play the next 17 moves. So we're going to see some action. And we don't know the evaluation, which is going to be really interesting to look at later. But hopefully we'll be able to look at this position, learn something along the way throughout the game, revel in the excitement of it, and enjoy it, and eventually look back at this as a memory, the time that we watched Nakamura and Nepo in the candidates' essentially semi-final, second last round between top of the ladder. So here we go. It is Jan Nepomniachtchi to move. What would we be thinking about here if this is us playing against Nepomniachtchi? Is he thinking now of playing a move like this? I mean, I would absolutely guarantee that he's not. Because if that's played, bishop takes knight, also hitting the queen. And at the very least, white has to ruin the pawn structure around his king there. Possibly, at the worst, takes with the queen, then ruin the pawn structure, and allow the pawn to be captured by the rook, going down a pawn with a worse pawn structure. So this is not going to be played, which means this bishop's still kind of, as Daniel Naroditsky would say, biting on granite, although I was reading a book called The Game of Chess by Dr. Tarash, who was an old, strong grandmaster from the history books. I think he was in the early 20th century, early to mid 20th century. And he actually employed that term, biting on granite, and I'm sure Naroditsky will have read that book at some point in his upbringing. It's probably in his consciousness or subconsciousness from that. But at any rate, the bishop is kind of biting on granite. It's doing a good job. It's definitely doing a good job. It's a defender of this very important pawn. Very important because it is the source of white's counterplay. Really, white is playing through the center here. White's not so much playing for an attack against the king, although in certain circumstances there might be such options as we were looking at before of going check, with this pawn out of the way. If you could get this knight here and then play this check, that could be very annoying, or it could be at least a source of a repetition or a source of a way to win an exchange or something like that. But really it looks like playing through the center here is white's goal with this pawn, which is a passed pawn. It has now passed. These pawns no longer have the ability to capture this pawn. You can't capture sideways, you have to capture like this. And because it's now beyond that square, the only thing that can stop it is Nakamura's black pieces. But because of that, it's got the potential to become a queen more easily than any of Nakamura's pawns. This pawn can always be stopped. This pawn obviously can be stopped in a million different ways. So this pawn is a big asset for Jan Nepomniachtchi. And this bishop is a big defender of the pawn, at least for now. Now, ultimately, this bishop is of the wrong color to defend this pawn in its promotion square. It's the wrong color. Unless you plan to promote with a capture. Now, that's going to be very difficult to foretell. But in the meantime, what if we, as black, were considering playing a plan such as b5 and then c4, trying to knock this bishop away? If this bishop had to move away, then perhaps we can scoop up this pawn, and, how good's that? Must be good, right? So Jan has to be thinking prophylactically about what's he going to do against b5. Therefore, does he now currently want to play this move a4? Well, I don't think that necessarily helps, because you play b5 anyway, and then c4 is on the cards. Unless you immediately take. So I'll show you the variation. If you were to play a4, b5, let's say you take take again, and once again c4 is on the cards. So I suppose, though, one drawback from black's perspective with that variation is that the moment you play c4, yes, the bishop will move back, and this will become an undefended pawn. I was going to say that when you move this pawn forward, you give up this square for the knight. But that's not so much of a problem, because immediately you'd be able to take the bishop. Although, that said, once you take the bishop, and let's say you capture back in one way, shape, or form, although when this knight moved, maybe we've already taken the queen, and then this takes back. So no, I don't think that this would be a problem, because if this is played, let's say takes, and boom, the pawn is gone. So basically, that's a long form of saying I don't think a4 really does defend against this idea of crowding out this bishop, which I think is what Nakamura wants to do. So Jan is thinking here, he's thinking very, very deeply about what he wants to do, because I think this might be Nakamura's idea. Playing b5, playing c4, shutting the bishop out, and going after this pawn. Now, in this position, there is pressure on this pawn, but this pawn is really nicely defended, and can probably be defended again in some very crafty ways. For example, another move Nakamura might play or think about would be this knight g to h4. Don't really need to say g because it's the only knight on the board, but knight h4. You could have a capture and a trade, but it would allow the defense of this pawn with the g pawn, although that is not something I think Nakamura wants to do, because it just simply opens up the king way too much, and it trades off pieces, and frankly Nakamura probably wants to win. Perhaps this isn't even such a great threat. Perhaps it's not even such a big threat with this amount of defense. So anyway, what is Jan going to do against this idea? Because I think that's a very nice idea. I think what he, in general, could do is try to get a counterattack going, but how's he going to do that? You can't bring this rook in to attack the pawn, because you're just going to immediately lose an exchange for no reason, and allow a queen trade, and then lose this pawn at the same time. So that's unthinkable. Could you do something like this and just slowly develop the rook? Maybe. Maybe you could. Although you then allow knight f4 with tempo against that rook, and we've got another tempo at the same time against the pawn, I guess that rook could then slide across. And that's an interesting idea, isn't it? Rook e2, knight e4, forget about it. Forget about it. Jan has played a totally different move, so he surprises us here. He's come back, which in a way could be an offer of a draw, because if you're Hikaru Nakamura, you could consider just bringing the queen back here. And would that not be already a repetition? I'm not sure. Of course, if you're Hikaru, you can consider here trading, but I don't think you want to do that, because it takes away this nice idea of going after this pawn. If you take, actually he's going to take with the rook, and thereby have two defenders of the pawn. So I don't think we're going to see a trade here. I really don't think we're going to see a trade. At the same time, we can't take this knight, because we then lose the queen. So I do think we're going to probably see queen g5. And keep in mind there that, as I was saying earlier, you don't yet have this fork because the rook guards, but it is kind of a secondary source of counterplay other than this passed pawn, which is being played through the center of the board, and we do see queen g5. If this were to be played now, of course, we still have this checkmate, so we can't allow that. But I think something else we may well see here is, I think Jan would be happy to take a draw. So I think Jan would likely play this move, knight f3, and essentially offer a draw. And it's going to be up to Nakamura then to have a think about whether there's any other place he can put the queen. Now, initially in that position, I had suggested queen f6, and I don't see a big problem with that. It takes aim at this pawn. It's still a very natural square for the queen. It restricts his knight. And, you can still, once he does something to look after this pawn, probably this move, I think, is what he would play with this in mind as well. You could potentially play this move. So let's say knight f3, queen f6, rook e2, defending this pawn, and then b5. Well, then let's say the rook actually comes in here. Or would it be better timing to do as we had said? So let's say knight f3, queen f6, rook e2, knight f4 hitting the rook, rook d2. And then, and only then, you've got actually a couple of options. If you wanted it, you could swing the queen back this way and again ask for a checkmate. So I think there is still plenty of play here for black. I don't know, the position's probably still even. But I would have a feeling, especially being 5 minutes up on the clock, being a very crafty and quick player, and being someone who wants to play for ostensibly content on his YouTube channel, more so than actually anything else, I think Hikaru is going to continue the game. I don't think he's going to allow a draw through repetition. I think he would play queen f6 and, either go down some sort of a variation like this and go after this pawn, or a variation like this and go after the pawn, and make Jan defend with not a lot of time and in a very dangerous position, and just keep on going and get to move 40. Both players get another 30 minutes. But if Hikaru has 20 minutes at move 40 and Jan has 1, which might happen if Jan has to burn a lot of time defending a dangerous position here. So this is what I'm predicting, is a knight f3, and there we go, Jan's played knight f3, and now I'm thinking we're probably going to see queen f6. I don't think he's going to want a repetition. This would essentially also be a way for a repetition to be offered. Actually, no, it wouldn't, because after queen g4, if the knight came back, you could actually capture the knight, and the queen no longer hangs. But also after queen g4, you might just see something like h3, and now you have to come back. The king's got a little hidey hole. So I would think queen f6 here, but Hikaru's going to think about it. He's got a 5-minute time edge. I don't think he's going to sacrifice the queen by doing anything else. I don't think queen h6 is anywhere near as natural or productive. I think this is very natural, comes with tempo. I would play this move right now if I were Nakamura, because I don't see an issue with it. Now, one issue that I do now see potentially with knight f6 is rook e6. I didn't see that earlier. But I guess the reason why that might not be a problem is, as I mentioned, we then swoop in and take this pawn on b2 and go up a pawn. In the meantime, you might then see this rook coming in. But, okay, the queen can retreat to a variety of squares. And, yeah, I can see why maybe Nakamura doesn't want to do that. How active does Jan Nepomniachtchi's piece harmony become after something like this? I would imagine there you could even play a move like this. There is no longer a checkmate threat because the queen is all the way over here. The pawn is advancing. Or even if the pawn doesn't advance straight away, let's say the bishop moves back, there's an attack on this pawn. There's a building attack on this pawn. Yeah, we might well see a repetition here. But give me a moment. I need to pause the video to tend to my baby daughter. I'll be back and we'll see what's going on in the game. In fact, I'll leave it ticking so you can watch. No, I won't. I'll pause it. And just for a moment, I've come back to the game because Hikaru made his move and he did in fact play Queen H5. And you've just seen Jan has played Knight E5. So I would imagine here we're probably going to see Hikaru play Knight G5 again. And I have a feeling this game is going to end in a repetition. And as we said, the reason is because probably if we came here, Jan's going to have all sorts of counterplay, which is very scary. And really, what else do you do if you're white here? The attack on the white queen, sorry, for black. Attack on the white queen king seems to have disappeared. This passed pawn and this well sort of supported square in the future for white really means that I don't think Nakamura has anything better. He doesn't want to trade and just strengthen white's position here with this passed pawn. So I do think, unless he comes up with some sort of genius move, and he has 21 minutes on the clock and is a genius, so it's possible. But I really do think we're probably going to see this repetition happen. Let's find out. I'm going to pause the video again because I have other things to do and I'll be back later. And yes, just like that, we did have repetition and the game has ended in a draw. So both players now on 8 points. And what that means is that tomorrow we will have the final round of the tournament. In that final round, Jan Nepomniachtchi will be playing against Fabiano Caruana, who is exceptionally strong. In the first cycle of this tournament, Caruana and Nepomniachtchi drew their match together, or drew their game together. And Hikaru is going to be playing against none other than Gukesh tomorrow. Gukesh is the Indian guy who's also currently on 7.5 points, so it's probably important to see what Gukesh is doing right now. So how do I look at the other games? Because, yes, if Gukesh wins today, he'll be in the outright lead. If he draws, then he's still the same as Hikaru. So really, at this point, anything can happen, but we'll have to come back tomorrow and see. There's going to be quite a few players potentially vying for the victory. Good chance we're going to end up seeing playoffs between some of them. So let's just see if we can have a quick look what's happening in the game with Gukesh and what's happening in the game with Caruana. And then we'll leave this little video here. So in the Caruana game, Caruana versus Prague, Caruana is up on the clock. I actually will just quickly turn on the computer evaluation here. Looks like he's got a good position. Nothing amazing, but he's got a decent chance of winning here, which would actually put him also, if he wins a full point, he will, since he was only a half point behind, he would now be equal with both Nakamura and Nepomniachtchi, if he can actually win that game. And meanwhile, we have Gukesh versus Alireza, and Gukesh is in a bit of a drawn position, so I guess anything can happen. Anything can happen at all. But yeah, between Hikaru, Jan, Gukesh, and Caruana, tomorrow, depending on what happens in these last two games, tomorrow is going to be a very interesting day as well. So tune back in tomorrow. If I can do another live stream, I'll do a live stream tomorrow. Actually, no, I won't because I've got work to go to. So I'll watch someone else's channel. See you later.